Hey guys, so we're at chapter 11. It is your very last chapter for Bio 1010. Yay! I'm sure you're happy to be done with new content. So let's jump in and get started on this first section of chapter 11 on evolution. It's a whole new unit. If you bump up and go to Bio 1012, you're going to have a repeat of this. You'll touch back up on evolution again in Bio 1012. So this is the last chapter of 1010. So as it says, everything is a product of evolution. Like everything that you know of now, that you are seeing and experiencing now, none of this stuff was around back in the day. Everything's a product of evolution. So, why do I say this? Because back in the day, the earth was super old and it did not look at all like it does now. So, how old is the earth? It is 4.6 billion with a B, billion years old. When did the first life show up? About 4 billion years ago. So 4.6 billion years ago, it was this rock with no atmosphere, and just not a whole lot of anything on there, but some poisonous gases and some water, nothing in it. Um, it was pretty inhospitable. First signs of life weren't until 4 billion years ago. And then we can fast forward from our single cellular things into multicellular things, from our prokaryotes into our eukaryotes. And eventually, about 130 million years ago, we started to see the things that we see now, mammals and birds and flowers. But for the longest time, the earth did not look like it did. It was old and hostile. There was very little oxygen in the environment back then, and we needed the prokaryotes, some of the first forms of life, to come along and terraform the earth for us. And now we have all sorts of things that we recognize today: mammals and reptiles and birds and flowers, all that good stuff. Um, it wasn't until about 200,000 years ago that our bipedal modern humans arrived on the planet. We were not here until, God, Homo sapiens were not here for sure for very long at all. So when you compare like 200,000 to 4.6 billion, we are just a blink. We are nothing in the grand scheme of things on Earth's evolution. Um, Views on evolution has totally changed. It's kind of all through here. So let's start back to the first people that we know, oh, excuse me, that we have record of anyway, or talking about it, are the Greek philosophers. The Greek philosophers. So Plato, the man, thought that things didn't change. What you see is what you get, and that is always what it was and always what it's going to be. That was Plato's. Things did not change, and they remained static the way they are. His protege, Aristotle, believes that things did change, that organisms changed over time. This was Aristotle. So he kind of flipped the script on Plato. And then let's fast forward, fast forward, fast forward. We are in the 1600s. In the 1600s, the Catholic Church slammed down on this belief because there was a bishop, an archbishop actually, James Usher, and he did his own calculations because all the priests have to do biblical study and theology, and by his calculations, he determined that the earth was only 4,000 years before Christ, before Jesus. And that was his calculation. That was the belief that was going to be the law of the land on the Catholic Church. And so if you did not believe that, then it was not good, especially back in the 1600s. If you went against the Catholic Church, it was a huge no no, excommunication, possible execution, like just bad things. So it really put the kibosh on trying to study evolution at all. I mean, nobody wants the Catholic Church breathing down their neck about that. So for about 100 years or so, nobody was going to get famous talking about evolution because of the Catholic Church. So let's move forward. We're going to move forward. Leclerc, who was a count, thought that he noticed that. Oh my goodness, I can't stop yawning. I'm sorry. He noticed that in similar environments, say the tropics, I'm in the tropics, and I'm definitely not in the tropics in this picture. I wish I was. In this picture, I'm in the Smokies. But if I was in the tropics, I would see that, it's all warm. It's near the equator. It's all warm environments. But if I look at different places, different locations in the tropics in the same environments, I'm still going to find different animals. I find different animals despite having the same sort of kind of environment. So, different animals in similar environments. Maybe I went to the desert and I saw, deserts in the southwest of the United States versus deserts in Africa are going to have different animals. So, despite having similar environmental conditions, different animals. This was Leclerc. Then James Hutton thought that changes occurred very gradually. Changes were gradual with James Hutton. Then we have Lamarck, Jean-Baptiste de Lamarck. And Lamarck came along and he was born in the 1700s. So some time has come along since, the Archbishop and his decisions. So Lamarck has come along and he has a theory about evolution and he's pretty close. He's pretty close. This is his theory. His theory is inheritance of acquired characteristics. And we're going to talk about that. So let's bounce over. In Lamarck's theory of acquired characteristics, it's just like it sounds. You acquire these traits, and that's going to change the way um, the animal behaves, looks, does its thing. It's going to acquire these traits based on their behavior. So the example is we have a giraffe, and we know that giraffes eat vegetation. They are plant eaters. So the giraffe is constantly reaching up, reaching up, reaching up, trying to get the leaves on the top of the acacia tree or whatever it's trying to eat. And so it's constantly stretching its neck to reach those leaves. So that must be why they have stretched necks because they're using them all the time. So they have acquired these characteristics over an individual's lifetime. That's not the way it works, but it's close. It's close. It's good theory. It's a good theory. So they acquire these traits within their lifespan. Um, and then they will pass on those traits to their offspring. It's a good try. This is Lamarck's theory of acquired characteristics. Let's keep going with some other names that you might need to know. Charles Lyell had a theory of his own. Charles Lyell, his theory was uniformitarianism. Uniformitarianism. So he's going off of the idea that the changes that made the earth look the way it did in the 1700s are the same processes that have been happening for all this time. Gravity is gravity. The laws of physics are the laws of physics. It didn't matter if they were the laws of physics a million years ago or today. Those laws of physics, the geology, laws of chemistry, all of those things have been happening. Didn't matter how long ago it was. Whatever was happening then are the same things that's happening now. So, based on this uniformitarianism that those laws are uniform and they happened all throughout time, he based his belief that the earth was probably closer to millions of years old instead of the few thousands that the Archbishop Usher thought it was. So, uniformitarianism, Charles Lyell, is his theory. Physics, chemistry, all those laws that we have in our environment were the same laws that have been happening for millennia. Then we have Darwin, Charles Darwin, and Alfred Wallace. And Darwin gets the credit, but they both kind of came up with this together. They kind of toured around together. But Darwin published first, he gets the credit for the theory of natural selection. And then later we have Pope Francis, who says that evolution happens and that God is not a wizard, but we'll get to that later. So, what did Darwin find out? What did Wallace find out? So, here we have pictures of both of them. Oh, my goodness. I cannot stop yawning. My goodness. So what they did, almost most people know, but just in case we don't know, the island that they made famous was the Galapagos Islands, and so they would pop into this place annually. They'd stop by, and that they noticed that depending on the environment, different birds had different beaks depending on what they were eating. If somebody was eating really big seeds out of a certain type of plant, then they would have really big beaks. And if something fed on smaller seeds, then they would have smaller beaks. And then they noticed that over time, after they kept visiting, after Darwin kept coming back, that it would fluctuate depending on the crop of the year. If the bigger seeded plants did really well that year, then you're going to see more bigger beaked birds to go along with them, and vice versa if it was the smaller ones. So the theory is natural selection. That's the theory based off of the observations from hitting up species in the Galapagos and checking down, writing down all their characteristics and studying them. So here's the theory. It is characteristics are inherited. Characteristics are inherited. Inheritance is key. I can I don't know, pull a Brad Mondo and bleach my hair and decide to color it pink. But that's not going to pass on to my kids. If I dyed my hair pink, that's not going to pass on. That is not an inherited trait. So these traits have to be inherited. That's step number one. Step number two, there is competition, 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 because resources are scarce. There's only so much water. There's only so much food supply. There is only so many ideal places to make my shelter if I'm an animal, to go to sleep, to raise my young. If I'm a plant, there's only so many places with the proper soil conditions and sunlight for me. Resources are scarce. So there's competition for resources. So that is the characteristics number two. And then offspring, all the offspring, their characteristics must vary. Offspring characteristics vary. So we're going to get into sexual reproduction and talk about, why you wanted to do that. And we mentioned that earlier in the semester. We need genetic variation. So the offspring characteristics, they need to vary. You need offspring with big beaks and little beaks and everything in between. And when you have variation, those offspring might be more successful than offspring that are all the same. Because if everybody's all the same, and something happens, everybody all has big beaks. And the plant that makes the big seeds that go with the big beaks, maybe a fungus comes along and kills that plant, and now you're out. Everyone is affected. Everybody loses if everybody's all the same. So variation is key. Offspring characteristics vary. So you may need to know these three characteristics of natural selection. It is absolutely that survival of the fittest. If offspring traits vary and there is competition, then it will be survival of the fittest. Here is a picture of those different bird beaks I was telling you about. So we got little skinny ones. Maybe these guys like to eat insects. And here, smaller seeds and bigger seeds and middle of the road. They could go either way. Maybe this guy likes to feed off of, what is this guy? Nectar and insects, which makes sense. They're trying to get down these flowers with like some curvy beaks with some really long um, stemmed flowers with those really pretty like trumpet shaped flowers. That would curved beak would be helpful if you're trying to get into those. So we have here, oh, we have the founder species. So this is the finch. The founder is the finch, and not just one, but at least a male and a female blew over from the mainland and they landed in Galapagos. And once this finch landed in the Galapagos, it bred like crazy. And then over time, these small changes over time, realized that there were all these different environments. So the founder comes over, breeds, breeds, breeds. We have variation in the traits. And then when we have variation in the traits, maybe, the ones with curvy beaks noticed that they could get into flowers where the other ones with the straight beaks couldn't. So that's a whole new food source to explore. So then those with the curved beaks started to breed and breed and breed, and they were successful in their environment. And then maybe these guys over here noticed that there were a ton of insects on the Galapagos, and that was going to be their food source. And so those beaks that were specified for insects and did really well in insects, they survived, they bred, and they kept that cycle going. If you are able to reproduce in biology, you win. You're a winner. you were able to reproduce and pass on those genes. And that is how evolution works. It is survival of the fittest. There's a variety of traits, and the traits that work for you are called adaptations, and those will help you in the long run. They are going to help you survive. They're going to help you get food. And if you are healthy and you have food and a place to live, then potentially you can find a mate and pass on your traits. That's being biologically successful. So these guys, they found different food sources, insects and nectar and seeds, and those variation in traits allowed them to change small changes over time that made them better and better at those specific environments with those specific food sources. So variation is important. We need variation. It is going to come from mutations in the genetic code. Um, is where we can get variation. We can get it from sexual reproduction, combining our genes with our mate's genes for our offspring. And we can also get variation in mutations um, with new alleles. If that trait, if that new variation helps you and aids in your survival, like we talk about the curved beaks and the flowers, and being able to get nectar when before you couldn't get nectar, now you got a curved beak and you can, that's an adaptation. That is an adaptation. Um, we said that Darwin was noticing when they would come back, when he'd come back year after year, and they have been tracking these birds for forever. That it depended, bird beak size changed depending on the food source. What was the food source that year? So here we have 1976, before I was born. In 1976, here we have two different birdlings. We have kind of smaller birdlings and we have bigger, smaller and bigger birdlings. And right in the middle, this is our average. The mean is your average. This is our average bird beak. So we can see the most are in the middle. Most beak numbers, the average is somewhere in the middle measurement. So a medium-sized beak is the most popular in 1976. So after 1976, there was a drought in 1977, and that reduced the number of small seeds. So a drought came along and took out the small seeded plants. And so um, if you have a small seed beak and the small seeds are all gone, you don't have a whole lot of options. It's not like you can bump up to the bigger seeds with your small seed beak. So you are not going to have as much food. Resources are very slim, and likelihood is that you are not going to make it. You will not be able to reproduce and pass on those genes. You might starve to death if your resources are gone. So that's what happened to a lot of these small beak birds because of that drought, because their food source that they were specialized and keyed into was really low because of the drought, and we were left over with the large seeds. Those did not get affected by the drought, and so we have the mean change. Here is our average now over here. Before it was 9.5, somewhere in between 9 and 10. I'm going to say roughly 9.5 millimeters. And now our average has totally shifted. We're a solid 10, if not over 10 millimeters on beak depth. And that's just within 1 year, 2 years, because of that drought. So you need variation in traits. That is why sexual reproduction is really good, because hopefully that variation is going to prove to be an adaptation for your offspring in the future. Yes, we need variation sources, mutations in the genetic code, and sexual selection. They are going to be the ultimate source of new alleles. When I say new alleles, those are an allele is a trait. So I have brown eyes. Maybe you have blue eyes. Maybe you have green eyes. Um, eye color is an allele, and you may have variation in that. And then again, if it's something that helps aid the survival of an animal, it is an adaptation. Dog is snoring in the background. All right, patterns of evolution. We have divergent and convergent and homologous and analogous. Let's talk about those. So, Divergent is usually what we think about. When we think about evolution, I think about trees, phylogenetic trees, and how they branch apart. So here we have this common ancestor, this guy, and this common ancestor is the root, the trunk of the tree, and all these branches come off of there. And so we get this guy, excuse me, stegodon, a mastodon over here, the woolly mammoth is over here. These are all different branches. It's divergent evolution, where these are, these adaptations were further and further along from the offspring, and then eventually they're a whole new species. And so we have all these different species, and we end up with present day. Present day is always going to be at the end of your timeline. Here's the bottom, the most ancient on the timeline, and here is present day. Present day, we have African elephants and Asian elephants. So we have two left of the eventual um, offspring, two left from the original guy down here. This original guy down here would be called a common ancestor. So this paleomastodon is the common ancestor for mastodons, for stegodons, for mammoths, and for our what we now know as Asian and African elephants. That was their common ancestor. So this is divergent evolution from a common ancestor. You. More divergent evolution, we have flowers. Flowers are all angiosperms. They are going to reproduce with pollen. They are going to have sperm and eggs and pollen grains, and they're going to have little eggs. And we're going to fertilize that. That pollen's going to spread from flower to flower, and we may have pollinators like bees or other animals that are pollinators. Birds can help pollinate, and bats can help pollinate. But on these different types of flowers, we have that they came from a common ancestor because they are going to have similar basic body parts, male parts for flowers, female parts for flowers. That even though they look different, this one has really skinny petals and this one has big, thick petals. Even though they look slightly different, the basic parts are still the same. There are still male parts, there's still female parts, there's still flowers. So this is divergent evolution. Convergent evolution is where you see the same trait, but that trait did not come from a common ancestor. This is convergent, meaning that it converges in a similar aspects, but they don't come from the common ancestor. They evolved these themselves over time. So here we have marsupials, and these guys are super cool. You're going to see these in Australia and New Zealand are marsupials. And this example of a marsupial is called the sugar glider. The sugar glider is really cute. They used to have them in pet stores. I haven't been in a pet store in a long time, but um, I used to see these guys, and they are a marsupial. And if you go into Bio 1012 and you talk about all the different things, marsupials are a type of mammal, except with marsupials, they have a pouch, just like a kangaroo does. And they're going to have reproduction similar to ours, but instead of the full gestation like we have, and baby pops out and baby's pretty much self sufficient, marsupials have to finish the development of baby in the pouch. And so the baby will continue to nurse in the pouch and develop that way. That's a marsupial. Totally different continent from where we are. So these guys living in Australia, sugar gliders. And then we have these guys. If you have ever seen one at night, these are super cute. These are flying squirrels. We have these. We have these around in Georgia and Alabama. We have them in lots of places. These are flying squirrels in America. So totally different continents where these things are from. But if you look at them and you just glance at these things, it's a furry mammal. It operates at night. These guys are night dwellers, so you have the big eyes that help them bring in all the light so they can see what they're doing. And then they both have this flap of skin that helps them glide from tree to tree to tree. So they look very similar. The traits look very similar, but it didn't come from a common ancestor. These evolved separately. So this phenotype of big eyes, flap between the arms, it's a mammal, glides from tree to tree. This phenotype looking like this and looking like this evolved separately. It's not coming from their common ancestor. That's convergent evolution. Let's talk about homologous and analogous. We brush up against this concept later on in the PowerPoint, but I just want to make sure that we get started on this and we nail this down because we're going to have a couple of questions about this on the test, and I want us to understand. On homologous, homo means same. Homo is same, hetero is different. If it is homologous, it's coming from the same common ancestor. A homologous trait has something that all of the other animals are going to have because the common ancestor had it first. And so we just carried that through. So if you look at this picture, we can see here's a humerus, and we have an ulna and a radius and some carpals, some wrist bones here. And if you look at the dog, look at this. It's a humerus. We got an ulna, we got a radius and some carpals. And look at the bird and look at the whale. And if you saw a whale in the water and you saw, a person next to it, you wouldn't think, oh, yeah, that's clearly the same kind of animal. But they have homologous structures. They have the same basic bone makeup. It looks different definitely on the outside, but structurally they're the same. So that is homologous because we're all tetrapods. We all have four limbs. We all have four appendages. That's a tetrapod. So everything that came from that common ancestor, that first amphibian that walked out of the water and made it onto the land, is a tetrapod. And so if we were talking about bones on birds, if we were talking about a bird wing and we compared it to a bat wing, both of those guys, their common ancestor was a tetrapod. They're both going to have the bone structure sort of similar. So that is a homologous trait. If you look at human development, I think this is fascinating. I teach anatomy and physiology, and I really like looking at this. I think it's super cool. If you look at a human embryo, look at this. And then look at a chicken. Obviously, people and chickens do not look alike, but look at us in utero. I mean, we look identical. And you know why that is? Because we're all vertebrates. We're all vertebrates. So we share very similar traits. We all have the same five things that happen. We're all chordates. We all have a dorsal hollow nerve cord. We all have a nodal cord. We all have pharyngeal slits. We all have a post-anal tail. Everything that is a chordate has these traits. So those are homologous traits. We all have them. The common ancestor had them, and we look very similar. This is, I would say, like 4 or 5 weeks. This embryo is for a person, and this chicken embryo is definitely way earlier than that because chicken hatch in like 2 months. Um, and it's just really cool to see. And if you have the time, you can click my little link for the Japanese chicken egg video because I think it's cool. It's some Japanese students that take an egg and they crack the egg open. They put it in saran wrap and they seal it up so it's a saran wrap eggshell instead of the other calcium-based eggshell, so you can see through it now. And then they put it in an incubator, and you could totally watch that egg grow and develop. You could see the chick growing in the video, so it's really cool. And it's kind of like a game show theme in it too, which I think Japanese game shows are great and entertaining. So if you have a second, watch the video. It's not very long. I think it's like 3 minutes for this. If you want to play around and make sure that you know the difference between homologous and analogous, check out this animation. So what's an example of analogous feature? It's kind of like convergent evolution. Here's an analogous feature. We got fluffy white Arctic fox, and we have this ptarmigan, and it's also white. But was the common ancestor white? No, no, the ptarmigan's ancestor wasn't white. The fox's ancestor wasn't white. So it's not a homologous trait, which means it evolved separately. It means it's an analogous feature. It's an analogous feature. So it may look similar, but unless it came from the common ancestor, it's not. a homologous. It's analogous. It's analogous. So definitely get those down, and we'll see them again later on the PowerPoint. I need y'all to understand homologous and analogous. Homologous is the trait that looks similar between two animals because the common ancestor had it first. Analogous may be a trait that looks similar between two animals, but that common ancestor did not have it first. These evolved separately, like convergent evolution. Um, Other terms that we need to know and speed of evolution. We have usually when we talk about speed and how it's small changes over time. And just so y'all know, sometimes it is quick changes in a relatively short period of time. Usually we're thinking about small changes over, hundreds of thousands of millions of years. And eventually, we get something that looks totally different. But it can be pretty quickly. The example is the peppered moth. And originally you can see it was white. And then the Industrial Revolution came along, and the Industrial Revolution, way before we had, the Environmental Protection Agency and anything like that, there was no air quality measures back then, and so there was soot everywhere, soot on everything. Soot landed everywhere on the trees, on the people, on the buildings, everywhere. So if you were a white looking moth and you were landing on a soot covered tree, the birds are going to pick you off because you might as well wave a neon flag, neon sign that says, "Come eat me." So the shift over time from these peppered moths that look like they just had pepper sprinkled on a white background. Eventually, the darker the ones that had looked like they had more pepper on them, the darker colored that they became, the better they blended in. So eventually, they turned to black, and they were safe on these dark pollution covered areas. So it didn't take too long for that animal to be able to adjust its population over time. Great tits is a type of bird that you can find in the UK. I think it's a terrible name, but that's its name. It's its common name is the great tits. And there's a lot of birders in the UK, just like there's birders here. And so everybody likes to feed birds, right? So what they discovered in this article, if you click it, is that we've been affecting their offspring by using bird feeders. The great tits beak has evolved to where they're better at squeezing into the little holes in the bird feeder. So we have impacted their species and their evolution by using bird feeders and feeding them at bird feeders. If we want to talk about really quick changes over time, bacteria are where it's at. Bacteria we said can reproduce in a lab if it's E. coli in perfect nutrients and great conditions. It copies itself in 20 minutes, 20 minutes. And they can pass those plasmids back and forth, like we talked about in our plasmid project. And when they pass genes back and forth in those little plasmids, maybe those plasmids have antibiotic resistance in them. So please watch this. I think this is super cool and fascinating. This is bacterial evolution. It's really neat to watch this time lapse video of how fast bacteria can evolve to become resistant to drugs. It is eye opening to see how fast this changes and how heavy of a dose that these bacteria can now tolerate where they couldn't before. So, bacteria can evolve so fast. It's a really cool watch, and it's a very short video for bacterial evolution. Terminology on evolution. When we're talking about gradual change, microevolution, and then we talk about a whole new species is risen about, that's going to be macroevolution. Um, okay, more terms, more terms. Population, a population. A population is going to be a group of the same species. So, a population of students on the GHC Cartersville campus, a population of wood ducks found in the Lake Allatoona area. A population is going to be the same species found in a specific area. That's population. The gene pool is going to be all the different alleles. Um, if we talked about all the different alleles in a certain population, if we were talking about the population of students at the, again, I'm just going to go Cartersville because that's where I teach face to face. If we're talking about the population of students at the GHC Cartersville location, then I would go around and just take a survey. Who has dark hair, who has light hair, who has dark eyes, who has light eyes, all the different traits How tall are people? All of those different alleles, keep track of that. That would be your gene pool. That would be your gene pool. And when we talk about endangered animals, we're talking about a very, very slim gene pool. We need variety, right? That was like one of the third tenets in natural selection, is that we need variety in those traits to pass on. We need, the bigger the gene pool, the better. Gene pools are good. Fitness, with fitness, that's going to be the frequency that those alleles are going to lead to reproduction. So if you are biologically successful, I said that you win. You are successful. You have high fitness if you have passed on your genes. If you have a kid out there, you are biologically successful. You are considered fit if you have passed on your genes biologically. If you have a kid out there, you have proven biologically that those traits were successful. Um, Not all of us have the goal of having children in our lives, and that is totally cool too. But biologically speaking, it's all about passing on your genes. It just is. Okay, so that finishes our very first section, and then we are going to do the next video on the next two sections.